menstrual disturbance is sort of the best early warning sign based on the evidence currently. So how would you know, like what would you define as a menstrual disturbance for a woman who's running and maybe not eating enough, but doesn't realize it because let's say her weight is steady and she feels okay. She just feels like she's training hard. What would what would be the sort of the warning light to her that her menstrual cycle is disturbed and not just kind of natural fluctuations?
So without any test kits or equipment or anything like that, it's the regularity of their cycle, how long the cycle is, and is it happening within the same sort of, so let's say a cycle is usually 30 days in length. Is it always within a 5-day window of that 30-day length, or sometimes is it 38, sometimes is it 21? If you start to get irregular cycles like that's a sure sign. But my gut would tell me that if someone went immediately from eating enough to quite severely not eating enough, they would probably just see an absence of menses right away.
Okay.
So they may not get those long, short, irregular cycles. Might just go straight into that their menses disappears altogether.
So it could be, I guess I may be speculating here, it could be like a spectrum where you see sort of smaller disturbances when energy availability is only slightly below what is needed, and all the way up to complete absence of menstruation if the energy availability is severely below what is required. And that's where... Hi guys, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. My name is Matthew Boyd. I'm a physiotherapist and running coach. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're so inclined, share it with a friend. Today, we're going to be talking about bone health and menstrual cycles. So if you have ever suffered from shin splints or stress fractures, or you're a female runner who has irregular menstrual cycles, then you really need to listen to today's episode. We're going to be chatting with Mark Hudson, who's currently finishing up his PhD at Loughborough University looking at these subjects. So that's enough out of me. Let's get into it. So Mark Hudson, welcome to the Adaptive Zone podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So to start off with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional work?
Sure. So I'm currently coming to the end of my PhD at Loughborough University. I guess it started when I did an undergraduate at Liverpool John Moores. I did a master's straight after that in sports nutrition, and then spent a couple of years traveling. During that time, I worked as a performance nutrition consultant. I worked as a performance nutritionist before I went away. But after a year or two of doing that, I decided that what I wanted to do was get back into academia and back into research. So I started the PhD at Loughborough. Brings us to here near the end, and looking forward to whatever the next chapter brings.
So when do you hope to finish the PhD?
I should finish by October for sure. Careful of whether my supervisor listens to this or not, but I should be able to finish a good bit before that if I really spent the whole time writing. But I was in the lab this morning, and I've only got a few sessions left of data collection, and then it's all up to me, really.
Okay, and I presume that, because we connected because I'd read a couple of studies by you, and I presume that is what you're doing your PhD about. So could you tell us a little bit about, the subject of your PhD?
Sure. So the overarching subject is low energy availability and its effect on health and performance, essentially. We're focusing primarily on bone health and on vascular health. And in the bone health side of things, we're also looking at a brief exercise intervention, which might help mitigate some of the effects that you see on bone.
Right. Okay. And so just to sort of bring the listener up to speed a little bit before we sort of dig into your research, could you just sort of give us a quick summary about, what's the trouble with bone? What kind of bone injuries do runners particularly suffer from?
I guess anyone can get a bone injury if the force is great enough and you get a traumatic fracture, which people will probably know the most about. But Runners, particularly distance runners, are at an increased risk for bone stress injury, just because of the way those stress injuries manifest. And then you've got a number of things on top of that which can change the stability, the strength of bone, which will either increase or decrease the risk of injury as well. And low energy availability is one of those factors.
Okay, and what is the most common bone stress injury for runners to get?
You typically see anything that's close to the point of impact is most common. So anything around the foot or the tibia, particularly the lower half of the tibia.
Okay.
You see them elsewhere as well, but they're typically most common close to the point of ground impact.
Okay. And so are these fractures? Are they stress fractures? Are they like shin splints? How does all that sort of sit?
So as far as my knowledge goes on the term shin splints, to me that is a stress fracture. A stress fracture can occur anywhere along a continuum, really, from just a localized area of the bone that's got a temporary area of weakness and lots of bone turnover activity going on, which we'll maybe go on to describe after this. It can go anywhere from that point where you might feel no pain or just a slight niggle, all the way along to a full cortical fracture of the bone. And they tend to progress gradually along that continuum until they reach a point where the pain is too great or the bone snaps.
And why does this happen? I guess that's a big question, but basically, why does this happen?
Big enough question, but answerable. So we'll stick with runners as an example because that's probably going to be the primary audience we're speaking to. In running, you've got this situation where you've got repetitive impact with the ground. The impact's not necessarily large, but you get it over and over again. You may have a rest of probably maximum a day if you're properly training runner, and you go again. But mostly it's not even a day's rest, and then you go for another long stint of repeated impact. And we mentioned before there, the way these injuries progress is that they start with a focal point where the impact is putting a strain on the bone. You get a temporary area of weakness. If you then continue to put that loading stimulus onto that same local point of weakness, that exacerbates and you end up with micro cracks that start to coalesce and join into a larger injury. But to really understand sort of the etiology behind them, you sort of need to talk about how bone adapts to loading. So the way it does that is once you put a stimulus on bone, and if we talk about a really specific point on one bone, it senses the area of strain. You then get cells that come in and break bone down on that area called osteoclasts. And in that place, osteoblasts come in and they lay down new bone. But that process takes time. So what you get when you continually hit that point on the bone with the same stimulus is you get a lot of osteoclast bone resorbing activity in that area. And if you continue to do it without enough rest in between runs, that area of breakdown will just continue to multiply without enough time to lay down new bone. So you get this sort of temporary area of weakness. It's then more susceptible to micro damage, which sort of has a knock-on effect moving forwards.
And is that the training effect when it happens correctly? So say you run, you cause a bit of damage to let's say your shin bone, and you get that osteoclast activity that you mentioned, and it breaks down the bone a little bit. And then over the next, let's say, 24 to 48 hours, I don't know how long it takes, but the osteoblasts come in and they sort of rebuild the bone and they make it a bit stronger because of that training stimulus. Is this what we want to happen most of the time?
Yes, that's a healthy way that the bone adapts to loading. Yeah. So that micro damage in the osteoclast activity is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's definitely a good thing because it's the way the bone adapts to loading. But it's that consistent application without enough rest between runs for the bone to recover before you then go and do it again.
Okay. So in a normal circumstance or in an ideal circumstance, this is what would be happening during the course of, let's say, a 20-week training program. As you put stress on the bone, you cause some damage, you rest it, it sort of builds back stronger. And then if you take someone who, let's say they haven't run a marathon before and they just get up one day and go run 42 kilometers, then their bones won't have been through that process. And they're almost, they're very likely to break down to such a degree that they would develop either a stress reaction or a stress fracture in let's say, their tibia or maybe one of their foot bones. And that's what we want to avoid versus what is, ideal.
Absolutely. And in that situation, if someone just goes and runs a marathon and they don't run, you might well find that they start experiencing those symptoms during the run because their bones just aren't adapted to that anywhere near to the magnitude they need to be. And it can start to occur that quickly, where you start to get areas of pain and stuff within the marathon.
Right. Okay. And so you mentioned a couple of times this term low energy availability. Could you explain what that is to us and then sort of how that links into this bone stuff we're talking about?
Sure. So in the simplest terms possible, low energy availability is when your body doesn't have enough energy left over after exercise to fuel all the rest of its processes that it needs to do optimally. So as a formula, it would look like energy intake. So that's everything you eat during the day minus exercise energy expenditure. That's the energy that you've expended only in planned exercise. And it's usually expressed relative to fat-free mass.
Okay. So isn't that a good thing? I thought that's what we wanted, to get lean. We spend more energy than we take in, and then we get lean and we look great and we perform better. So what goes wrong?
To a point, but you can't keep underfueling a system, otherwise it runs out.
Okay. And is the issue sort of this chronic underfueling, like long term, or can this happen, in, let's say a month or two?
So we actually start to see changes associated with low energy availability within 3 to 5 days.
Okay.
But those would just be like sort of acute hormonal changes, and they're typically reversed just as quickly as they happen. So not necessarily bad, but those changes in mostly endocrine hormones, which are hormones that are released from somewhere in the body and they have an effect somewhere else on some other tissue or organ. They show us or give us a sign about what then starts to happen if you stay in this state for weeks or months. So you start to see suppression of certain systems like reproductive function and bone maintenance and possibly cardiovascular function. So essentially what the body's doing there is if you continue to underfuel it, it starts to regulate the amount of energy that's used in other processes, reduce the amount of energy that's used in those processes so that it can maintain a level of homeostasis, maintain some balance.
Okay. And this is a tricky one for me to wrap my head around. So why doesn't the body, we've got all these fat stores, so presumably we have some energy stored somewhere. Why doesn't the body just go and grab that and use that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, and there isn't much research that's done in people who are overweight or obese. Right. And there is some suggestion that if you do have plenty of excess body fat, there may be some protection against these sort of effects. But typically in the populations that are at risk of low energy availability are people that expend lots of energy, like endurance athletes, mainly like runners or any kind of athlete or exercisers who typically will already be quite lean.
Okay.
So the body's already near that sort of level of healthy body fat. It maybe doesn't want to take any more away from that.
So this low energy availability, I don't know if this is the case or not, but is this something that should be more concerning to people whose sort of BMI sort of falls within the ideal range for their demographic anyway? That they're the people who should be wary of this low energy availability, or or do we not know how it manifests?
My gut would say yes.
Okay.
simply, we don't know. The research isn't there to be able to answer that question. But for the reason that you suggested earlier, my gut would say yes, they're the people definitely that are at more risk. You can sort of think of it as like, let's say someone who eats too much for a long period of time, they will start to have poor health consequences because they've gone too far in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
The same essentially starts to happen in the other direction.
Oh, okay.
If you've already spent a long time in one direction and then you start to underfuel, that's probably going to be beneficial up to a certain point until you go too far and it starts to happen in the opposite direction. So it's sort of the way I look at it is a scale, and you can go either way. And that sort of reconciles why in some research you see that energy restriction has beneficial effects on markers of health, especially in overweight and obese populations, because it's bringing them back towards that baseline.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it depends kind of where you are on this particular spectrum of how much energy storage you have on your body, and if you're closer to sort of somewhat normal physiological ideal or optimal range, then having low energy availability, so not enough calories and too much training, is a problem. But if you have lots of energy stored, then you maybe have a little bit more room for error.
Yes, yeah. If you've got a lot of energy stored because you've had too much energy availability for some time, so your body's been storing it away, reducing it's probably going to bring you back to that your baseline, wherever that may be. And it's not just in my area of research or physiology that this concept comes about as well. There's a few different theories in evolutionary biology where they're looking at something similar too.
And so what type of, if we stick to the group who acquire low energy availability, how does that relate to bone injuries that you were talking about earlier?
So we stated there that when your body is low on energy for a certain period of time, what it does is, by some sort of evolutionary thing that's left over in us, it starts to downregulate the function of certain processes so that it can maintain some balance. And in these evolutionary theories that I was mentioning, what they propose is that it downregulates systems that are deemed in that moment to be less vital for survival, which would make perfect sense. And it seems like the maintenance of bone and the bone cell activity is one of those systems that gets downregulated. So what you typically see in this, what we can measure in the blood, is markers of osteoclast and osteoblast activity, which we mentioned earlier. And within sort of the same time period you mentioned earlier, 3 to 5 days, you start to see certainly a decrease in bone formation and possibly an increase in bone breakdown.
Okay. So I guess my sort of simplistic way of thinking about it would be, if the body's like, well, you're doing loads of exercise and expending lots of calories and you're not taking enough in, you're not replacing them. So I'm going to focus on short-term things. So I'm not going to waste my money on building bones. I'm going to spend it on other stuff like moving and breathing.
Yeah. And if you think in those evolutionary terms, which is a good way to think, it sort of puts this, it helps it make sense. In times where food wasn't available, their primary goal would be to expend energy to find it, not to expend energy, repairing their bones or on their reproductive function, which they're not thinking about when they're close to starvation. So essentially that's what it's doing. It's partitioning energy to the systems that are most vital for survival.
Yeah, because we kind of think of it in our current situation where you just go to the shop and get some food. But if you're in a situation where there is no food, then, there's no point having good, strong, healthy tibia bones if you can't, like, run after the antelope you try to chase or whatever. You have to go get him first.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is there isn't many studies on it yet, but there's a few that have done sort of 3 or 5 days of low energy availability and then a performance test, and it doesn't seem to be impacted too much.
Huh. Yeah, because it's that short-term systems have been maintained at the
Yeah.
expense of long-term projects like bone health. And
Yeah.
and you mentioned, and I know you talk about in your studies a lot, menstrual cycle disturbances. So is this one of the other systems that you were saying is, and is this like an early sign of low energy availability when you see menstrual cycle or hormonal changes?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the best one we've got in terms of overt signals for someone that's been suffering from low energy availability for weeks or months is the menstrual function. It's also got the best evidence to support it. So there's controlled studies for months that track people, and they see these menstrual disturbances start to set in from the early hormonal signs right to they're now having non-ovulatory cycles or not having a cycle at all.
I see. So is this a problem that principally affects women or only affects women, or is this a problem for guys too?
At the moment, we're sort of at the point where we can see that men also have low energy availability. It's there within samples of male athletes. Whether it affects them to the same extent as women or not is still sort of up for debate. Especially in the short-term studies, men seem to be a little more robust. Some explanations for that sort of linked to how much energy it costs to maintain men's reproductive function versus women's reproductive function. Women's being a greater expense, energetic cost-wise than men's. So perhaps that has something to do with it.
I see.
But it could be anything really. But it seems like possibly men are more robust, but that's only going to be up to a point.
Yeah.
If you underfuel something by enough for long enough, it's going to have some sort of effect somewhere.
And you were saying that menstrual disturbance is sort of the best early warning sign based on the evidence currently. So how would you know, like what would you define as a menstrual disturbance for a woman who's running and maybe not eating enough, but doesn't realize it because let's say her weight is steady and she feels okay. She feels like she's training hard. What would what would be the sort of the warning light to her that her menstrual cycle is disturbed and not just kind of natural fluctuations?
So without any test kits or equipment or anything like that, it's the regularity of their cycle, how long the cycle is, and is it happening within the same sort of so let's say a cycle is usually 30 days in length. Is it always within a 5-day window of that 30-day length, or sometimes is it 38, sometimes is it 21? If you start to get irregular cycles like that's a sure sign. But my gut would tell me that if someone went immediately from eating enough to quite severely not eating enough, they would probably just see an absence of menses right away.
Okay.
So they may not get those long, short, irregular cycles.
Mm-hmm.
Might just go straight into that their menses disappears altogether.
So it could be, I guess I'm maybe speculating here, it could be like a spectrum where you see sort of smaller disturbances when energy availability is only slightly below what is needed, and all the way up to complete absence of menstruation if the energy availability is severely below what is required. And that's where, you hear about athletes who, professionals particularly, it's been in the media a lot more in recent years, where they haven't had a period in like years, and they didn't even realize it was a problem. They believed that this was just normal. So is that normal? Is that acceptable? Is that something that you can do for a period, or does this have serious health implications?
It's absolutely not normal. It is something that you can do without serious health implications on a short-term basis. But for me, when that sign comes, that's when something needs to be done about it.
Right.
Before anything more serious starts to set in. That disturbance of menstrual function is reversible,
Mm-hmm.
as far as we know, to a point. But things like osteoporosis, which would then happen if you stay in that situation for months to years, which is severely low bone density and low bone strength, that almost becomes irreversible, particularly as you get older. So Yes, it's possible to be in that situation. No, it's not normal, but it's a sure sign that something needs to be done to recover it.
Yeah, so it's a red light. It's like, no,
Yeah,
this isn't okay. This isn't something you can put up with for a time. Like, you don't have to be super worried if it's happened to you, but you do have to take action and address it.
yeah,
And you shouldn't just accept it, because it does have in the medium and long term serious consequences.
yeah, absolutely. And it's funny that, I mean, that's the difference when you compare like the evolutionary theories we were talking to the physiology ones. The evolutionists would say that those changes are for your benefit because ultimately they're helping you survive for as long as they can. But it's at the cost of optimal health, which is what a
Yeah.
physiologist would be more interested in.
Yeah, well, there's often this sort of playoff where really some evolutionary changes are really interested in gene propagation, really. So it's like
Yeah,
you have to live long enough to have your kids and make sure they survive, but who cares after that? You know, we
yeah,
don't think like that anymore. We're like, I want a good 100 years. I want to run my marathon on my 95th birthday, right? So
exactly. Yeah,
we
and
have a different standard. Sorry?
especially for athletes as well,
Yeah.
of prime
And
importance.
so I didn't really sort of drill down on this earlier, and I wanted to. You know, who should be concerned about this? Um, is this just women, or is this mostly women? And is this, you know, teenagers, 20s, 30s, 40s, like all of them? Who listening should be paying attention to this, particularly the early warning sign of the menstrual cycle as a sign of not getting sufficient calories?
Potentially anyone can have low energy availability. It's much more likely for athletes to have it consistently than just like a recreationally competitive runner or something like that. But anyone could be at risk of it. In terms of the menstrual disturbances, of course, that's only going to apply to women who aren't using hormonal contraception or aren't pregnant or haven't got any other reason why their menstrual function might be impacted by any other pathology or anything like that. So it's a great signal in the women who you can use it in, but that's only going to be 50% of the population, maybe
Mm.
less.
But they are the ones who are more prone to these problems.
It seems that way,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. It seems like at the same level of energy availability, on average, females are more susceptible than males. Um, but I'll make sure that I've quite clearly said seems that because I'm
Okay.
not completely sold on that yet, but it
Okay.
certainly
Fair enough.
seems that way.
Well, it's only recently, to my mind, at least in sort of more popular media, become a specific area of focus and study. I know it has been studied for a long time, but it's become more. You hear about it talked about
Mm.
on the news and things like that now, whereas before it was sort of discussed in academia and that was about it. So we're not potentially in a place where we know all the answers for men, women, for all ages, but everybody should be aware that it's a thing that happens. Something I wondered, because I get this a lot with my runners, and it's not just the women, it's the men as well. They use running as a way to lose weight because it's recreational runners, and it's not a lot of weight. It's not like if you looked at them on a BMI chart, they'd be in that like ideal category, but they're like, I want to lose 5 pounds, I want to lose 10 pounds, and at the same time, I want to ramp up my training and do my marathon. And I think what they might be thinking when they listen to this is, well, it's okay because I've still got that 5 pounds of fat. So I can't have low energy availability because I can see my energy in my love handle. So it's there. But can this happen to people even who are, to their mind, carrying a few extra pounds? Or does it only happen on the, people who are like, the super skinny and look almost kind of emaciated kind of thing? Who does this happen to?
Um, my suggestion would be it can happen to anyone. Most of the research so far is in relatively lean, young, healthy, mostly women. But because of the way the body adapts to these periods of low energy availability, what it essentially does is reduce the amount of energy your body uses. So let's say you start in balance with expenditure and intake. If you reduce your energy intake by however much, those adaptations are trying to bring that energy expenditure back down to that level. So theoretically, someone can have low energy availability because some of those processes aren't functioning optimally, but they will stay weight stable because they're in energy balance, which is where the two concepts of energy availability and energy balance differ. Energy balance is just an output from the system, what's left after everything's taken account of. Whereas energy availability is an input. This is what you've got to use it how you will.
If I try and put that in, again, more simple terms for me to understand, it's like, okay, you've got these stores, but you've been running a deficit in energy for a while now. So I'm just going to leave those stores there, and I'm going to not repair your bones. I'm going to not produce a menstrual cycle, maybe some other things that I'm not going to attend to. I'm just going to leave the stores there for a rainy day because you keep doing this, and I'm going to not focus on all these things that are important for the long term, and then we'll be good. Is that the narrative of what's going on?
I'm not going to pay my employees, so now the store's in balance.
Okay. It's good in the short term, but in the long term, it might not work.
Yes, and someone can their weight may stay the same. So that's the point really I was trying to make is that someone's weight could stay stable, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of their bodily processes are functioning optimally. That might be quite depressing to some people who are trying to lose weight, I think. So the way to do it is low and gradually rather than trying to shock the system and do it in short, quick bursts.
Yeah, you might be losing weight, but you're losing weight from your bones is the trouble.
Yeah, possibly.
I mean, I sort of led you into that question a little bit because I come across this all the time. Like it is in the last couple of years, I've started paying more attention to it, and it is unbelievably prevalent that runners are getting, bone stress injuries and tendon repetitive stress injuries in different places at different times over the years, and it's been going on for years, and they're trying to lose weight and they're not losing weight. Their weight is staying the same, but they're getting all these injuries, and I'm thinking this is an energy availability problem potentially. And then that's how I came across your stuff and other stuff like it is like, how do I know? And I guess what you're saying is menstrual disturbance is a really good sign for women. It's a good way to know, even if you're not losing weight, that you might not have enough energy availability. So I guess we're getting a little speculative because I know this isn't necessarily what you talked about in your studies, but if it's like, okay, you bring the energy back up for a time and we get reestablishment of these normal processes, so we're looking after our bones and we've got menstruation going on again in a normal way, then if you run a slight deficit for a long time, then your body may start to draw on fat stores, and then if you wanted to lose those 5 pounds or whatever, it may happen, but you have to reestablish balance first. Is there any evidence for this, or am I just kind of speculating?
I think you could probably bring parts from all sorts of different studies to put that picture together.
Okay.
But as far as a single study goes that shows that sort of a trajectory, I'm not aware of it. I am aware of a study which brought about a resumed menstrual cycle in people who were previously amenorrheic, so didn't have a menstrual cycle, within 3 months, just by increasing daily intake by around 300 to 400 calories a day.
Right. Did they gain weight?
Good question. I'll probably look at that after the call, actually.
I know, because that's what my athletes are going to think. They're like, if they gain weight, I don't care.
I guess what you might theoretically expect to see is a small gain in weight short term, which then quite quickly starts to slow down and you reach a new balance.
Because the system wants to be in balance, right? If you're expending energy all the time, it wants you to take in that amount, basically, with a slight fluctuation. So if you reestablish normal and then keep your expenditure the same, then you would expect the two to come into line, the amount of energy available in your body versus what you're taking in versus what you're putting out.
Yeah. And it might be, unfortunately, that someone is just naturally that weight.
Yeah.
And I would argue that it's better to be a kilogram or two heavier and be able to train consistently than it is to be a kilogram or two lighter, but be off with injuries and illnesses constantly.
Yeah, and performance-wise, because there's often sort of getting to race weight type concerns for more elite and professional or competitive runners, and then there is, for the more recreational runners amongst us, it's looking trim for the summer and just feeling good about yourself. But you got to offset that against the fact that if you don't have healthy bones, healthy menstruation, you're going to be injured a lot more. So you're going to perform worse because you're not consistently training. And that's something I see a lot. And that's amongst recreational runners as well as those who are more competitive. But I have seen it in those younger athletes who ran at college or whatever, but they kind of couldn't really do it because they were just out with injuries all the time. And then, I forget where I was going with that, but something I did want to touch on because it was a surprising statistic to me. I'm going to quote it from your study.
There's it. I'll add something. Hold that thought. I'll add something on to that conversation before we jump on to the next one. Is that the solution might be to that is to do something similar to what they do, let's say, in boxing and horse racing. Maybe not quite so severely, but to train at a weight and then a month before you run in an important race, drop your weight and stay at that for a month and then recover after the race.
Okay.
Might be
so that would address the race weight.
Yeah, getting both.
And is that how sort of elite athletes are approaching this now that awareness of this problem is becoming more apparent?
I'd like to think so. The answer probably is no, for the most part. I think it would probably take a lot longer than this for it to start to be like general practice. But in those weight category sports, there have been a few case studies that sort of show that as long as you don't stay in that situation for too long, you can come out of it exactly as how you went into it. Okay.
So, but potentially, working with your doctor, physiotherapist, dietitian, nutritionist, to try and make sure that you're doing this in a sensible way, would be the better approach.
Sure.
The surprising things I read it was more in the introduction. As a result, endurance athletes are at high risk of low energy availability, with approximately 31% of female distance runners and 25% of males reported to suffer from this condition during training. So a third or a quarter of endurance athletes have less energy available than they need. Is this, I don't know if you remember that particular reference, but is this elites? Is this competitive runners? Is this recreational runners? Is this everybody?
I do know this reference. So this was like elite and world class distance runners and race walkers. And they were in a training camp at the time. So they'll be pushing themselves pretty hard.
Okay.
I would suggest that those numbers aren't very surprising in compared to some of the other numbers that I've seen. Percentages go up as high as 50, 60% in some studies, but they also go as low as 0 to 10% in other studies. So it varies, and that one's probably falls somewhere in the middle.
Right.
The difficulty with the prevalence studies for low energy availability is how you measure it, which is really, really tricky. And you get a lot of variation just depending on what method you choose to measure it.
So what is menstrual disturbance one method, or is it do you look more at calorie counting? How do you?
Menstrual function is one method, and at the moment, personally, that's my preferred method to look at prevalence because you've got a nice window where they've been suffering from this for at least weeks to months. So in those people it is an issue or becoming an issue. The other alternative is, like you said, to estimate energy intake and expenditure, which is super difficult. I don't know if anyone's ever done it that's listening, but it's really, really tough to do accurately. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, you only do that for sort of 3 to 7 days. So you only get a snapshot look at what the energy availability is. And if it's only been like that for those 3 to 7 days, like in a training camp, then it may be no issue at all. So not only have you got how good is the measurement method at actually measuring what it's trying to measure, you've also got at what point along the spectrum of low energy availability is it falling, and is what we're measuring even a problem?
Right.
So, for example, you could measure changes in hormones, but we know that happens within 3 to 5 days and comes back just as quickly. So, is that really an issue or a prevalence of low energy availability? I would argue probably not. It's just a short-term response to something.
Okay, so our sign is the menstrual disturbance, particularly in women. Obviously, it's more difficult in men. Because I was wondering about hormone testing, and I was like, how would you set it up, and how do you know if this is a normal level for that person? Do you have to do a series? But I think what you're saying is that hormone testing isn't a useful way, at least for the people listening to this show who are going to be working with their physios and their doctors. Hormone testing is not the way, but tracking your menstrual cycle is a better way.
I mean, hormone testing, for any regular person, you wouldn't be able to do it often enough for it to be useful.
Right. Someday it'll be on my watch.
Yeah, that's it. Someday it'll be great. Yeah. Say I've been in this state for 5 days. I need to switch it around a little bit.
Yeah, we'll ignore that too.
Yeah.
Another concerning statistic you quoted was the highest prevalence of menstrual disturbance is observed in sports emphasizing leanness and endurance sports such as running, where it may be as high as 50 to 65%. Again, is that in the elite group? Are these, should I be expecting half of my female runners who come in to have menstrual disturbance?
Yeah, I guess it depends what level of female runners that you primarily work with. But most of those studies, because menstrual disturbance is quite an easy, overt thing to measure, a lot of those studies are done in quite high performance populations because they're willing to come in and do whatever they need to do to be part of the study. Whereas studies where you've got multiple visits, multiple blood draws, some sort of intervention, you don't really see them done in elite performers because they're not willing to do it. But a lot of those studies where you're looking at prevalence of menstrual disturbance are done in quite high performing populations. There are some that are done in more recreational populations, and the prevalence seems to be a little bit lower.
What type of amount?
I wouldn't know off the top of my head.
Okay.
You'd have to check the figures. I just remember putting together a table and seeing that on average the values were a little bit lower. But again, when you talk about everyday people, it depends. How often do they train? How much do they eat? It depends on the person. I don't think there's anything inherent about being high performance, possibly apart from the pressure to keep a low weight for racing purposes. But I know plenty of recreational runners that whose weekly mileages are way up there with what competitive performers would be. So they would probably be at just as much risk as anyone that competes competitively. Yeah.
And I think the thing is, what I'm getting from what you're saying is this can kind of happen to anyone. Because I sort of originally, a few years back when I started reading about this, I thought, this is a problem for those people who they come in and you get the vibe, they're a little bit obsessive, they're extremely thin, they train every single day, and they train for multiple hours a day in a variety of sports. But I'm sort of changing my mind now on that. And what I'm getting is that this can be much more common than we maybe realized before. And it might not be that obvious that someone has low energy availability. It might be a little bit more hidden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. And recruiting for this study we're running at the moment, so we need people who currently have a regular menstrual cycle, so that they're not already in any sort of state of low energy availability before they come into the lab. And I was surprised by the amount of people who don't fit that criteria.
Right.
It was more than I anticipated it might be.
Okay. And you had mentioned in your study something about the contraceptive pill and how that might interfere with using menstruation as a way to track whether your energy availability is sufficient. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So essentially, it would render the sign of menstrual function useless, because what an oral contraceptive would do is provide a short burst of synthetic hormone when you take the pill for most of your menstrual cycle. And what that does is suppress the release of that hormone within you. So you have like a profile of daily hormones where you get a spike of these synthetic ones, but your endogenously produced version of that hormone stays low. Then when you stop taking the pill for a week or however long it is, or you carry on taking the pill but it hasn't got any of the synthetic hormone in it, which is the way most of the pill cycles work, you then get an artificial menstrual bleed, which is just a withdrawal bleed because you've stopped taking the pill. So some doctors will say that it artificially regulates your menstrual cycle, which is not strictly true. It artificially regulates when you bleed, but it does not artificially regulate the cycle of hormones within the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, I guess what the way I was thinking of it, if menstruation regularity and behavior is the little warning light on the dashboard of your car, all you're doing with the pill is just like turning the light off or just like covering it over. You're not really, the problem is still there. There's not enough energy available to keep your bones healthy and to have a healthy menstrual cycle and these other things. It's just that you don't have that warning anymore.
That's spot on. Yeah, a good analogy of it.
So it's not a good strategy to use the contraceptive pill as a way to address this issue. It's not going to address it in any way.
Not in any way at all.
Okay. Yeah. And so what are you looking at with your research at the minute?
So at the minute, this study that we're coming to the end of is looking at a short period of low energy availability to replicate some of the other studies that have already been done on how it affects those markers of bone turnover, so the markers of osteoblast and osteoclast activity. But in some of our participants, in the morning and the evening, they're also doing a short, high-impact jumping routine to see if we can offset some of those effects that seem to occur in response to low energy availability. The idea being that we can give bone a stimulus, which would theoretically drive bone formation, see if we can offset some of the effects of low energy availability. And since starting the study and speaking to a few colleagues, another suggestion is that, going back to the evolution example, is that it puts giving the bone some sort of stimulus like jumping, puts it further up that hierarchy of how important it becomes. So the body may then start to divert more energy towards the maintenance of bone health. We'll stop there for now, and I'll see if you've got any questions before I can carry on talking about it.
So why would the jumping help?
So we already know that bone responds to high impact loading, and it doesn't need too many repetitions before it starts to become close to its maximum adaptive response. There's a lot of animal studies on that bone response, whereby you do like 36 impact reps, and then they compared it to like 200, 400, 600 reps, and there's no extra benefit beyond 36. So essentially, bone starts to become desensitized to that stimulus after a while. So if we go back to the running example, if you've got desensitized to the adaptive stimulus, but you carry on even the impact, you're still creating possibly some of that micro damage from running, but you're not getting any adaptive stimulus.
Okay.
Whereas with impact loading, you do a few high impact reps, which drive the bone adaptation, and then you stop. The benefit of that is that it's not going to cost much energy. So if someone's already in a state of low energy availability, they can use this sort of tool to stimulate bone without exacerbating the original issue, which is the fact that they haven't got much energy available. And
so what kind of exercises are you using in your study?
So we're using counter movement jumps and drop jumps. So the drop jumps are just to create a little bit more impact. You're coming off a 40 centimeter box, and this is without shoes and socks on, onto a hard floor, and then going straight into a counter movement jump. Mm-hmm. You also get a little bit of it loading from the ground reaction force from the side. So you're not just getting it vertically upwards. There's some multi-directional things in there as well, which seems to improve the stimulus for bone.
So you have them drop off a box and jump, and you do that like 3 sets of 12 or something, or?
We do 2 sets of 5 in each direction. So 1 set of 5 facing one way, and there's 10 seconds rest between each jump. So the intensity is pretty low, but each jump is maximum effort. But you get 10-second rest in between each one. We've then got a minute's rest after the first set of 5, and then we do the next set of 5 in the other direction. And we then got 2 sets of 5, just regular counter movement jumps from the floor. But that's not, I don't know if that's the best way to do it or not yet.
Yeah.
Essentially, what in the design of that exercise intervention was trying to get as much as we can for as little energy cost as possible.
And are you the only person who's looked at this so far? So there's no other studies you can look at and say, well, we know this kind of thing works.
So we are the first people to look at how this might work during states of low energy availability to mitigate the effects on bone. There are other people that have looked at the effect of these interventions just without considering energy availability in people that aren't athletes. So there's a lot of research in older populations with hopping exercises. There's also some in younger women where they do just 3 or 4 sets of 20 jumps a week for a long period of time, and you actually see changes structurally in bone. So from DEXA images, you see increased bone density.
Okay, so theoretically, it makes sense that this could help with bone health. The only issue is if you are in a state of low energy availability, does it work under those circumstances? Because things go a little bit awry under those circumstances.
Yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing is, we've seen that these kind of exercise interventions benefit markers like bone density. So when you look at a bone and you look at how strong it is, basically based on markers, you see that these exercise interventions help with that. So there's long-term structural changes in bone. But whether that means you see what you'd expect in terms of osteoclast and osteoblast activity is another question, because it's not quite clear yet how the short-term changes in those markers relate to the longer-term changes in bone.
Right.
Although it would make sense that more bone formation and less bone resorption would lead to bone growth.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more complex than that, and that might not quite be the case.
Okay, so there's a lot of unknowns still, especially in the low energy availability group, which might be quite large. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So I know it's difficult, but if you were gonna, let's take a healthy runner. Let's say it's a woman, and she has a healthy body weight and a healthy regular menstrual cycle, and she's a recreational runner in her 30s, let's say. What would you recommend she do just to try and make sure that she stays healthy?
Not using hormonal contraception.
Okay.
This woman. No, right. I presume that in the example she's not, is she?
Exactly, yeah. Because otherwise, we wouldn't know what her menstrual cycle was because the pill's just messing it up.
That would be my first port of call, would just to check. If they've come and told you they've got a regular menstrual cycle, the first port of call would be, is that without?
Is it a fake one?
Yeah, exactly. So in that situation, I would suggest that they start doing some sort of impact loading. To start with, it might be just jumping on the floor, and then you can progress by jumping off a box, and you progress by doing it with some weight and some multi-directionals and some hops and things like that. But for 10 minutes, maybe every other day to start with, something like that, and then build up gradually. And that would be in someone like the example that you've given, that seems like there's no danger of low energy availability. They're healthy. They're not losing weight rapidly. Their menstrual function's fine. They don't get bone stress injuries. If the opposite was true, then it's highly likely that adding more impact to the bone is not going to be beneficial. So it depends on the person you're looking at. Okay,
so if we take that same person and say that they're healthy weight and training and they're doing all right, but they have menstrual cycle disturbance and they know because they're not taking the pill, but it's not regular. What's the course of action for those people?
First port of call would be to take measures to increase energy availability, resume that menstrual function, probably for a few cycles consistently before you start in putting any additional loading onto the bones.
Do they need to reduce their expenditure? Do they need to stop training for a while until they get their menstrual function back? Or can they keep training and just try and eat more?
Again, not necessarily. They could just continue training and eat more. It depends how much they're already training, what situation they're in, context, how long they haven't had their menstrual cycle for, how many injuries they're getting, and a whole host of other things. So it really depends how severe the situation is. If they've just haven't had their last couple of cycles, then they could probably carry on training and just focus on trying to increase their energy intake.
And is a nutritionist the best person to work with here? Is it the family doctor? Because I'm always a little bit unsure where to go when I think this is going on. Like, who do I get help with this from? What do you think?
It's difficult. It depends on the reason why their energy availability is low.
Yeah.
If it's low because, it's just inadvertent, they just exercise a lot and they've just accidentally failed to eat enough for a prolonged period of time, which I would suggest is probably really common if you exercise a lot. But if it's deliberate, then perhaps just your regular nutritionist, unless they've had specific experience in dealing with that before, might not be the best place, or a nutritionist in conjunction with a psychologist might be a better route. So it depends why.
Yeah. So it's a sign of a problem. It's a symptom, and it's like, okay, what's causing this symptom? Because the other thing that you talked about in your studies was problems of eating disorders and other such things. And you mentioned, I think, at one point that particularly in young and more so female athletes, but it could obviously happen to men as well, that they have eating disorders potentially related to psychological issues, and then that's manifesting as bone stress injuries. But the bone is way down on the problem list, and they really have to go back to, okay, why are you not eating enough? And then it's like, okay, what is going on with any kind of mental health situation that's leading to this sort of trickle down effect that's manifesting as something that would seemingly be unrelated to that.
Exactly. Yeah. For someone who doesn't have that, who hasn't been given or provided the opportunity to get that sort of knowledge of how energy availability and what you eat links with bone health, then they would certainly seem completely unrelated. When in the true case, there's probably a direct cause in some people.
I think the big takeaway for me, from reading your work and learning a little more about this recently, is that women of all ages, unfortunately, need to track their menstrual cycle quite deliberately and keep an eye on it. Because especially if you're a teenager and you're, let's say, running track at college, and you start having menstrual cycle disturbances, you really need to nip that in the bud then, because, as your skeleton is developing and your body is sort of developing, that's when you need things to be at their most optimum, especially if you're wanting to do 5 or 6 years of heavy training and performance. Then you can't really afford to let that become just a sort of lingering issue.
Absolutely. And that's a really big issue, because the most of bone development occurs within the first, say, sort of 3 decades of life. And beyond that, like everything else, you're just battling to slow the decline. So not only if your issues are happening right in the, your teens, not only are you possibly getting bone stress injuries then, but you're increasing the risk of having hip fractures because of osteoporosis when you're 60 or 70. So it's a lifelong issue, really, that can start right in your teens. That can be very difficult to recover if it goes on for long enough.
And as much as that might be a bit of a pain, it can be very helpful. If you've been tracking your cycle for 5 or 6 years and you've been fine, and then you start having issues, you can talk to your doctor about it. You can say exactly when it happened, what was going on in your life, what might be contributing to it. And you might be able to dial in on that, that why you were getting to earlier. a lot easier if you've got that, backlog of information. Like I know this really well now, and I know this is not normal, and it coincided with a diet, or it coincided with an increase in training load, or it coincided with getting splitting up with my partner or something like that. It could be easier to find the why.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you said unfortunately when you said tracking, but they've got that marker, and it's really easy to track your menstrual cycle. It's not difficult. There's apps where you just press one button each day when you come on your period, and like you said, then if something starts to look a little bit different, you can match it up with your calendar. This started to happen here. Maybe that's the reason. And really, really useful and really easy to do. So I would encourage anyone and everyone really to track it, because there's no downside.
Yeah, I think that would as well. Like, just for any clinicians listening, just kind of getting used to saying, okay, what's it like? Is it regular? And are you tracking it? And how? And I think that's it would be easy for us if it just becomes more normal and common, and people get used to being asked by their doctor and their physio and their dietitian or their psychologist, whoever they happen to see, how's your menstrual function? This tells us about energy availability. This is relevant, and I'm not just being nosy or weird.
Yeah. I would say that more often than not, the awkwardness probably comes from the practitioner or the physician rather than the other way around. I think if you just ask it openly without any sort of any reaction like it's completely normal, it will be responded to like it's completely normal because it is. And I don't think any women looks at it in any way other than that. I know, because I have to talk about it to participants when they first come in, when I first met them, all the way through the study, and never had any sort of response. Well, why do you want to know that or anything like that? It's just straight up. Yeah, this is when I came on my period. This is how regular I usually am. No sort of hesitation about it.
And so that's the number one thing, is track your cycle. And number two would be potentially include jumping exercises on a regular basis. Is that provided you're not having issues, or is that just, across the board?
I would say definitely provided you're not having issues. So I think I mentioned earlier, if you're already having issues, then firstly, the main thing to address is the energy availability, but also depending on how long you've been in that state, if your bones are already weakened and you're still running, if you add more impact onto that, you're just going to increase the likelihood of a stress fracture, not reduce it, because you're just adding to that accumulation of areas of weakness and micro cracks and things like that.
This has been very, very helpful, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with a number of clients and with the listeners at large. So thank you very much for your time today, Mark. If someone wants to sort of follow your research and keep an eye on you, where would they go? And do you have any final thoughts that we didn't touch on that you wanted to sort of let people know?
I think we spoke a while there about being on the contraceptive pill and how you then don't get that signal for menstrual function. By no means would I advise not going on the pill if you're going on it for birth control reasons. Of course, that's the primary reason to go on the pill, and if that's what you want to do, you should carry on doing it. But I just in everyday life have come across a lot of young women who tell me that their doctors have told them to go on the pill to regulate their cycle because the cycle is not regular. At that point, if that's the only reason you're on it, then in my view, you shouldn't be. You should come off it and then address the problem.
All you did was unplug the light on the dashboard, or you put some tape over it, and then look, it's fixed.
bodged it. Yeah, absolutely. So that would be that popped into my head. I didn't get opportunity to say that, so that'd be the last thing that I would say. In terms of following my work and what I do, I'm reasonably active on Twitter, but that's about it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll put links to that I'll put links in the description to your Twitter and your ResearchGate as well. And thank you. It was this has been very, very interesting and helpful, and I look forward to following your work in the future and reading more that you guys come up with. See if these things do help, these interventions that you're working on, and it's really exciting. So thank you.
No problem. Thanks very much. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me. It's a pleasure to talk about it.